Walking through the site of Pompeii is unlike touring any other Greco-Roman site. The excavated portions of Corinth are nothing by comparison in terms of actual acreage uncovered, so that in Pompeii you can truly lose yourself in antiquity like nowhere else. Unlike Rome or Athens, which have similarly extensive areas of excavation in terms of acreage, Pompeii is continuous. In Rome or Athens, we move back and forth from walking in the ancient world to walking through the modern city to find the next excavated area, so that we are continuously being brought back out of the ancient past to recall our distance from it. Not so in Pompeii. There one can walk all day, morning to late evening, in the ancient world, never seeing the same feature twice. And then one could come back the next day and do the same in the other half of the archaeological park. It is an immersive experience of the Roman world like no other, and therein lies a great deal of its power. A second distinctive feature of Pompeii, which is also true of its neighboring ancient town of Herculaneum, is that we find ourselves in much closer contact with the ordinary people of the 1st century AD than anywhere else. Rome is filled with the remains of the monuments of the great and the vast buildings that are the consequence of the ambitions of the great. Pompeii, while it has its fair share of these, is mostly homes and shops and bakeries and fast food joints and recreational areas and all the places that speak to us of the people of the 1st century who are most like us. A third feature that sets Pompeii apart from so many other sites in the ancient world is one attached to its particular and tragic fate. Many of the residents of Pompeii are still at home to be visited as we tour their city. An estimated 2,000 people, between a fifth and a tenth of the population, died within Pompeii's walls. Dozens of the dead have been found, their final moments captured now by the plaster that was used to fill the cavities in the hardened ash left by their decayed bodies. As we walk through this recovered city, we can never forget the cost that made its preservation for millennia possible. Burial by Vesuvius, protected for posterity by a 17-foot thick blanket of ash, pumice, and rock, fused by the waves of superheated gases that swept over the city. As a German poet, Johann Goethe, once wrote after his visit to the site in the 19th century, "Many disasters have befallen the world, but few have brought posterity so much joy." These are people who look back at us not only with the eyeless stares of the plaster casts, but with skin, expression, and even warmth in the many portraits of the city's residents that survive. We can look upon the faces of Terentius Neo, proprietor of one of the more successful bakeries in Pompeii, alongside his literate wife, who may have kept track of inventory and accounts for the family business. We see the face of a woman whose name has not been recovered, perhaps the lady of the household. We see Eumachia, one of the great patronesses of the city, who funded the building of a large market area and also served the city as a priestess of Venus, the city's patron goddess. Eumachia, at least, died a natural death, as her tomb has been discovered occupied just outside the city walls. While a walk through classical Rome, then, is in many ways a tour through the great events that made the late Republic and early Empire, a walk through Pompeii is a tour through the daily life that filled up the long gaps between those events deemed worthy of historians. What we encounter throughout Pompeii are those facets of the Roman world that reflect much more closely the greater part of the lives of the first Christians, those audiences whom the apostles gathered into communities called ecclesiae, and to whom and for whom the documents of the New Testament were written. Pompeii was a well-placed, well-laid-out, and well-defended city. In its day, it had a wonderful view of and access to the Bay of Naples. The Porta Marina, today one of the main entrance gates for site visitors, led to the waterfront, with its docks. This was before the fallout and lava flow from Vesuvius created an additional mile of terra firma between Pompeii and the sea. A particularly affluent neighborhood to the west of the Porta Marina enjoyed splendid ocean views from their terraces and roof gardens. Pompeii was built as an independent, walled settlement prior to the rise of the Roman Republic, and it continued to be reinforced into the 1st century BC when it was finally made a colony of Rome. 7 gates, each of which could be shut and defended from above, allowed entrance. These included the Porta Ercolano, opening onto a road that led to the nearby city of Herculaneum. The Porta Nuceria, with its road leading to the rival city of Nocera. And the Porta Vesuviana, leading to the vineyards and farmlands around the base and up the sides of Vesuvius. This fresco of Bacchus or Dionysus, the god of wine, hence the fruit of the loom costume, beside Vesuvius, reveals that the Pompeians' impression of Vesuvius was that simply of a benign and fertile mountain where the wealthy landowners of the city had their major vineyards and orchards. Just outside the Vesuvian Gate, which has not survived, we can see the better preserved remains of one of the defensive towers that punctuated the wall. Inside the gate, sitting at the highest elevated point within the city walls, is the Castellum Aquae, the main junction for the flow of water into the city, connecting the aqueduct to a system of channels directing the water throughout the city. One of the astounding accomplishments of Romans was running water throughout their cities, filling public baths, continually flushing public latrines and sewers, and flowing into fountains throughout the city to provide clean drinking and cooking water to its thousands of residents. These fountains, incidentally, are now equipped with modern plumbing to provide cool drinking water and bottle refills to tourists and staff throughout the long, hot days. The heart of the city was its forum, the center for administrative, religious, and commercial activity. Major streets led into this space from the east and from the north. The city engineers showed a great deal of thoughtfulness, even including crosswalks at regular intervals to allow pedestrians to cross the roads without getting their sandals wet during rainstorms or the ongoing flushing of the roads due to the constant flow from the fountains. Wheeled traffic could pass through, but would have to slow down to do so, increasing pedestrian safety. The city was developed essentially in a grid pattern and is, by and large, very easy to navigate. Pompeii was a city of people who respected their gods. In the center of the north end of the Forum stands the Temple of Jupiter, with the remains of its altar in front of it. A copy of the head of a cult image or idol of Jupiter can be seen inside the sanctuary. The temple was actually dedicated to 3 gods, those that made up the Capitoline trio: Jupiter, his wife Juno, and his daughter Minerva, worshipped on the Capitoline Hill of Rome and in similar temples in Roman colonies or cities throughout the world. It takes a leap of imagination to move from the visible ruins to the temple as it once stood. It would have been quite similar to the Temple of Augustus and Rome in Nîmes, France, another 6-columned temple with access only from stairs in the front. On the west side of the Forum sat the Temple of Apollo with its large sacred area. Apollo was the god not only of music, but of order, rationality, and inspiration. A little further to the southwest sat the Temple of Venus, the patron goddess of the city at least since the 1st century BC. Set on the edge of the plateau of the city, this temple would have been prominently in view from the sea and from the road leading up through the Porta Marina. On the east side of the Forum stood a temple to the Lares, the protective spirits of the city. Worship of the Lares, whether of the individual home or the larger community, was one of the most traditional features of Roman religion. Across the city from the Forum stood a temple to Asclepius, though some scholars believe this temple was a second one dedicated to Jupiter. Asclepius was the god of healing, popular in cities throughout the Greek and Roman worlds in this period when prayers were more likely to help, or at least more likely to do no harm, than medical professionals. Foreign cults also had a strong presence in Pompeii. Most notable is the temple dedicated to Isis, not far north of the theater district of Pompeii. As usual, only the framework of the cella, or the sanctuary that housed the cult image, is well preserved. Originally, one would have seen a row of columns creating a vestibule at the entrance. Walls that are now bare brick were once decorated with plaster covered by ornate frescoes. The cult of Isis was an extremely popular import from Egypt, focused on an ancient myth of death and rebirth that mirrored the changing of the seasons and return of life and fertility. A distinctive feature of Isis temples was a shrine of the sacred water of the Nile, the life-giving river of Egypt. Ancient devotees of Isis were as fanatic about water from the Nile as Christian pastors or lay people visiting the Jordan, insisting thereafter that their baptismal fonts contain some of the sacred water. The mystery rites of Bacchus or Dionysus were also probably celebrated in Pompeii. The stages of the initiation ritual provided the theme for the most stunning frescoes in the Villa of the Mysteries, and it is truly something not to be missed if you ever have occasion to visit the site. Deciphering the ritual still involves a lot of guesswork, but the overall movement seems to be one of the symbolic marriage to Bacchus, who is depicted in the center of the room with his mythological bride Ariadne, as well as a satyr. The ritual moves through a series of preparatory steps involving the reading of a sacred text and an offering, to the revelation of some sacred object, followed by beating the initiate, to the initiate's preparation of herself for the sacred marriage. Foreign gods and mystery cults are often understood as a sign of the spiritual hunger for something more than was offered in traditional religion. The residents of Pompeii took religion home with them. Indeed, we may have much to learn from the space given to religion in the home, both literal space and metaphorical space in terms of time and family devotion, from these pre-Christian precursors. A feature in most every house in Pompeii, as in Roman homes across the Mediterranean, is the lararium, a shrine for the worship of the lares, the protective spirits of a family line, as well as the genius, a spiritual power particularly connected with the head of a household, often alongside one or more of the traditional gods to whom the householder or family felt specially connected. In this painted lararium from the fast food joint of Vetusius Placidus, the genius of the household is shown sacrificing in the center, flanked by the lares. To the far left stands Mercury, connected with wealth in this period, and to the far right another of the traditional gods, perhaps Diana, the goddess of the hunt. These lararia could be quite ornate, like this one from the House of the Gilded Cupids, or simple niches in the wall. Several houses contain additional shrines. For example, the master or lady of the House of the Gilded Cupids was an avid devotee of Isis, creating a shrine for her worship in the corner of the house's garden colonnade. A room in the Villa of the Mysteries is decorated on every wall with small portraits of the various Egyptian divinities, suggestive of some family members' devotion rather than an interest in exotic ornament. In addition to honoring its traditional and imported gods, Pompeii was a city that revered its emperors. 4 large square or rectangular bases still sit in the south end of the forum, upon which once stood colossal statues of several emperors. These have not been recovered, but smaller examples have been found in the Temple of Augustus in neighboring Herculaneum, including these statues of Augustus and Claudius, both declared divine by the Roman Senate after their deaths. At the north end of the Forum stand several memorial arches dedicated to members of the imperial family, like this, the Arch of Augustus. These were once covered with marble and adorned with statues in their niches and quite possibly statues on their tops. Halfway along the east side of the Forum sits a temple dedicated to the worship of the deified emperors. This is typically called the Temple of Vespasian. On the front of the altar is a beautiful relief of a typical scene of sacrifice in Roman religion, with a bull being led to a relatively small altar prior to its slaughter, and a priest dispensing incense or grain over a fire on the altar as a kind of pre-sacrificial ritual. Through the Arch of Augustus to the north of the Forum, but not yet as far as the Arch of Gaius Caligula, stands the temple to the fortune or destiny of Augustus. This was probably erected during Augustus's reign and, in line with Roman sensibilities, stopped short of worshipping a living ruler as a god, worshipping the divine destiny that worked through him and in him instead. Once again, only the brick face of the cella or inner sanctuary, stripped of its marble bounty, remains. In its heyday, it would have resembled the four-columned Temple of Portunus in Rome. There was a special order of priests for the imperial cult called Augustales. Their emblem was that of the emperor himself, the oak wreath surrounded by laurel branches, such as is seen here over the house of a prominent member of this order. Members inevitably immortalized the fact on their tomb monuments, such as this one just outside the Porta Ercolano. Once again, we need to pause and reflect upon the boldness of declaring in such a context that a Jew crucified by a Roman prefect was actually the man appointed by divine destiny to rule over all the kings of the earth, as the emperors did now. At the time appointed by the one God, this Jesus would return and overthrow the political, economic, and social order of which the emperors were the guarantors and representatives, ushering in a wholly new order that would turn the present one upside down. Soaking in the religious atmosphere of Pompeii and reflecting on the amount of religious activity in the home, in the temples, and in the Forum, we can begin to imagine how significant a change of life was involved when one converted to Christianity, with its largely rigorous demand that its devotees keep themselves back from any form of idolatrous religion. The Pompeians, like most people in the Roman Empire, were a deeply religious people, and would no doubt have strong feelings about their neighbors starting to act and even speak as if their long-revered gods were fraudulent vanities. Think of the wife or slave in one of the houses of the rich in Pompeii, no longer paying honor to the household gods. Was this the kind of disobedience to the pater familias, the head of the household, for which Peter was urging Christians throughout the Roman provinces of what is now Turkey to compensate in their obedience, diligence, and submissiveness otherwise? Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure while you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 21. When would Christian slaves have to endure being beaten for doing what is right? That is, when would a Christian slave be disobedient to a master in such a way that the master would think this an act of defiance worthy of a beating, while God would regard it as an act of loyal obedience to God? It seems to me most likely that the author has in mind the situation of Christian slaves refusing to participate in the idolatrous cults of the household, whether in the house itself or in public religious festivals where householders would expect their whole entourage to be in attendance, parading the household's honor, size, and piety. It has also been suggested that this might pertain to a slave's conscientious objection to an order to provide sexual entertainment for a guest or a member of the household, again because of his or her devotion to the requirements of his or her one and only God. We read later in the same letter, "Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way, long ago, that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you." 1 Peter 3, verse 1 through 6. That last line could also, and I think could better, be translated, "And do not fear any intimidation." That intimidation would come from a husband expressing disapproval of changing in his wife's behavior within and outside the home. The common expectation was for wives to share her husband's gods and not engage in her own private cult. Plutarch writes specifically about this as a problem, arguing that no god would be pleased with what a wife does in secret apart from her husband. Peter appears to be urging Christian wives of non-Christian husbands to compensate in areas of traditional female virtues for the offense their new religious commitments have brought. Think also of the businessman, no longer honoring the god of the guild or of the wealthy councilman, no longer attending the sacrifices in honor of Jupiter Capitolinus. Turning from idols to serve a genuine and living God, as Paul put it, would have taken a lot of guts and aroused a lot of disapproval. What a great deal of social pressure and internal incentive there was to rationalize eating food sacrificed to idols for the sake of keeping one's own and one's family's social and economic lives on solid footing. Pompeians' heads were not always, however, in the clouds of Olympus or the slightly lower heights of their emperor's dwelling. This was a city also devoted to the daily nitty-gritty business of politics, commerce, and industry. The south end of the forum was given over to administrative business. In the southwest corner sat the entrance to the Basilica, a massive hall that was the center of judicial activity for the city. Along the south side of the forum, one could find the offices of the duoviri, the two chief administrators of the city, and therefore the two top men of the town. One could also find the council chamber, where the city fathers met, and the offices of the aediles, junior administrators, who were nevertheless entrusted with the oversight of buildings, public works, and religious festivals. Vesuvius erupted during an election year. All throughout the city, one can still see some of the graffiti promoting one or another candidate for office or for the city council. Most of these were simply endorsements rather than slogans based on a platform. They are more in the line of, "The Bakers Guild urges you to elect Rufinus," or, more personally, "The ladies who work in Attilius's bar urge you to vote for Cornelius." Some were ironic acts of indirect mudslinging, such as, "The thieves urge you to vote for Rufinus." The forum was also the principal market of the city. The wide open space would on most days have been cluttered with carts and other portable shops offering wares and foods of every kind. 3 major commercial buildings sat on the forum. In the northwest corner was the grain market, used now to store pottery and stone items found throughout the site. Across the way in the northeast corner, sat the Macellum, or principal meat and fish market of the city. Stalls for individual vendors lined the perimeter. Shops also lined the exterior of the Macellum. In the rear center stood a shrine to the Augustan family, a sign of the loyalty of the businessmen and vendors of the place to the father of the fatherland, as Augustus and his successors were called. In the southeast of the forum was the building of Eumachia. This is thought to have been the principal fabric market of Pompeii. Eumachia was a wealthy patroness of the city, a priestess of Venus, as the inscription over the rear entrance to the market area attests. In the rear of the market interior was a large shrine to Concordia Augusta, the harmony within the imperial house that assured the peace of the empire and the peaceful succession that would preserve the empire, yet another sign of the blending of commerce and imperial cult. Many of the houses, shops, and businesses of Pompeii had decorative plaques made from fired clay fitted into the brick face of their buildings. A number of these appear to be indicators of the particular business pursued in the shop, or in some cases, in a whole block. For example, the decorative mold of the goat may indicate a woolworking shop or district, whose outlet would likely have been the building of Eumachia. Large stone vats with built-in furnace areas in another building suggest a cloth dyeing facility, also part of the large garment industry of the city. Another plaque shows tools associated with masonry and carpentry, while another, of two men carrying a large amphora, suggests a block given over to the wine or oil industry. The pottery vessels that have survived and are now stacked by the hundreds in the old grain market attest to the booming trade in wine, oil, and other commodities that once flowed through this city. There were large vineyards within the city, and far larger vineyards and olive groves planted in the rich soil along the slopes of Pompeii, and especially its volcano Vesuvius. The southeast quarter of the city seems to have been given over especially to cultivation of fruits and vines for local consumption. The city administrators took measure to enforce fair trade, represented in the forum by a table containing standard measures. The exact manner of its use is unknown, whether an official periodically checked the measures merchants were using to sell product, or whether customers could use the facility to test the honesty of the vendors they frequented. A striking feature of Pompeii is not that it was a city of rich and poor, but that it was a city of rich and poor living shoulder to shoulder. There were no slums in one corner and gated communities in another. The entrance to a rich family's dwelling was often next door to a modest craftsperson's shop, 2 doors down from a fast food joint, and 3 doors down from a 2-room apartment. This image shows the layout of one of Pompeii's city blocks, the one dominated by the so-called House of Menander. Taking a closer look at the kinds of units one might find in a single block reveals its variety. Dominating the center and the upper middle and the right side is the House of the Menander, so named because of a portrait of the comic poet Menander found in its courtyard. It also shows this house's obvious expansion over time, incorporating at least 2 other major houses over the decades or centuries. We also find a semi-elite house in the lower left, which probably represents the more typical elite house within the city walls. The artisan houses in the upper left, still sufficiently spacious and perhaps are likeliest candidates for the level at which we'd find most house churches. We also see some very small areas separated now by walls. The house and the tavern in the upper right, located by doors number 2 and 3, and the other 2 modest townhouses in that quadrant, located at doorways 1 and 18. Could also see a terribly small living space and workshop off doorway 6 on the top of the block, and an upstairs apartment accessed by doorway 5. We can find the entrance in the bottom right to a fast food joint called in Latin a thermopolium at doorway 13. There are also 2 other one-room storefronts in that area, doorways 9 and 12. Sorry, 9 is in the upper left corner, 12 the bottom center. We see in this block and its partitions how medium to large size estate size villas would dominate a block, but within that block, areas would also be carved out for storefronts, often with apartments or lofts above them, thus serving the owners of the storefront, perhaps the workers accommodated on the main floor as well. The larger homes tended to be built around a similar pattern. The exteriors tended to be plain, with only doors for security purposes. All windows would tend to be interior windows, opening onto the courtyard or courtyards within, again for security purposes. Through the main door off the street, one entered into an atrium, a large room with a marble pool in the center. This pool, called an impluvium, would catch rainwater from above and allow it to flow below into a cistern for household use. The high roofs featured an opening of slightly smaller size than the pool below, and were usually built in a slightly concave fashion so as to catch more rainwater and channel it into the pool and the cistern. This opening also allowed a great deal of sunlight into the house. Several smaller rooms tended to be built off the sides of the atrium, benefiting from the source of light and fresh air. The lararium was often to be found in the atrium. Across the atrium from the entrance, one would find the tablinum, where the head of the household would receive clients and associates. The far side of the tablinum would open onto the peristyle courtyard, the columned courtyard that was the center of the private spaces of the house, and that was the other major source of light. Off this peristyle would be found the family's bedrooms, though these might also be located on a second floor, the triclinium or private dining room, where the head of the household would entertain close friends, the kitchen, and sometimes even a private latrine. If we stop to think about how the arrangement of the triclinium and how dining tended to happen in a semi-elite home, or elite home, and the ubiquity of the triclinium in the Greek and Roman East, we might formulate a much different picture of how a special meal in a rented dining room facility, such as the Last Supper, might have looked. The windows on the inside walls of rooms. This is where I wish I had editing capacity. The windows on the inside walls of rooms could be closed with wooden shutters, and rooms closed off with wooden doors. None of these have survived at Pompeii, although archaeologists were able to reconstruct a few by pouring plaster into cavities found in the ash as they excavated. Of course, the slaves of the household would also have rooms, or at least quarters, in the compound. The rich person's house was a kind of island within the island or insula of the city block. The houses of the rich tended to be single-storied dwellings with very tall ceilings. They were surrounded by the two-storied units, of no greater height, of the far more typical resident. Not much of the second story of Pompeii has survived, but significant numbers of two-story units were found in neighboring Herculaneum, as seen here on its main thoroughfare. The typical shopkeeper or craftsman had his shop on the ground floor, opening onto the street, with a cramped dwelling place for himself and his family on the shorter second floor above it. Only the rafters separating the ground floor from the upper floor survive in this Herculaneum shop, but if you look closely in the upper left of the picture, you may see a corner of a bed frame still attached to the wall on the second floor. Outside the city walls, where acquiring space was less of an issue, one finds sprawling villas several times the size of even the largest houses in the city. The Villa of Diomedes, for example, sports extensive enclosed garden areas, and the Villa of the Mysteries had no fewer than 50 rooms. When the author of the highly popular early Christian text, The Shepherd of Hermas, rebuked people who used their wealth to surround themselves with empty rooms and challenged them, instead of houses and fields, to use their money to ransom lives from danger and want, he no doubt had the owners of higher-end homes like these, and all who aspired to be like them, most in mind. One of the features for which Pompeii is celebrated is the artistic decorations of the houses of the rich. The Romans loved to surround themselves with color. There is hardly a bare wall in any of these houses. Some are simple murals imitating building materials in color. Some are more elaborate imitations of architectural designs like arches and windows. Those that have drawn the most attention are the frescoes of scenes from mythology, like Theseus killing the Minotaur, or the wedding of Mars and Venus, the sacrifice of Iphigenia at the start of the Trojan War, or Narcissus admiring his reflection in the water before trying to kiss himself, falling in and drowning. Many walls feature a mixture of all these types, such as this wall from the tablinum of the house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto, another of the not-to-be-missed houses of Pompeii. All of this opens up for us some amazing windows into the domestic setting of the house church, the fundamental unit of Christian presence and mission in the pre-Constantinian period. It was in house churches that the weekly meetings, Sunday before dawn and Sunday evening, took place. Almost every Christian meeting about which the New Testament speaks after initial evangelistic preaching in the synagogues and in open forums or the like happens in the home of one of the relatively better resourced members of the local Christian group. Think, for example, of the many references to the Christian assemblies that meet in a particular person's or couple's dwelling. The houses of Prisca and Aquila, of Nympha, of Philemon, of Gaius of Corinth, of Demetrius and of Gaius in the Johannine circle. As we look at the spaces of the homes in Pompeii, particularly the homes of the semi-elite down to the better-off artisan class, we can formulate a better idea of what worship on the Lord's Day looked like throughout the first and second centuries of the Christian movement. My goodness. The physical layout of the houses and the typical dining and entertaining practices of the first century might illumine the problem that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34, where Paul speaks about Christians gathering early in the day to start eating and drinking together, while workers and slaves who can only come in after the day's business is over or their masters and mistresses have dismissed them, come in to find the banquet over and nothing left but scraps. And Paul takes them to task because in their alleged celebration of the Lord's Supper in the context of an agape meal, they are simply reinscribing the social lines and the social stratification social superiority and inferiority that exist in the society around them, rather than creating a new community of equals, of brothers and sisters in the Lord. Petronius, a Roman satirist from the time of Nero, writes in one of his satires complaining about the dinner to which he was invited and the effects upon him of the differences in fare served to other guests and to him, where guests of higher status are given fuller plates of better quality fare, and guests of lower status are given smaller quantities of lower quality fare. And his satiric speech culminates in the accusation, "You have not invited me to dine with you, but to watch you dine." Something of that might illumine the problem in these houses when the Lord's Supper was really being treated more as the feast that rich householders give for other rich householders, and then also admit their lower ranking clients to. Houses like this were also essential because Christian teachers and emissaries depended upon hospitality for the exercise of their duties. We know this was a constant need. Think about the amount of hospitality required just in connection with the Corinthian letters. Every time a Titus or a Paul came to Corinth, a Christian householder somewhere in Corinth was making room and provision for Titus or Paul, not to mention when Apollos or Cephas or others breezed through for as long as they had in mind to stay. Provision would likely include supplies and even funds for the guest's needs en route to his or her next stop as well. We can imagine that such households became important resources for providing hospitality and help for individuals who were alienated from their native and natural households. What Jesus might have meant in his response to Peter, when Peter said to him, "Look, we have left everything and followed you." And Jesus replies, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands." We hear that in Mark 10, verse 1. It is through hospitality, through a network of Christian householders, that Jesus' promise finds fulfillment. We often don't reckon with the significant lack of centralization, and in most cities, maybe even interaction among house churches. Corinth was an exception, at least in the beginning, when Gaius's house was large enough to accommodate at least occasional meetings of all the various house churches together. This would have given increased opportunity for divergence of practice and organization if house churches never met together, and also give increased opportunity for deviant teachers to sink roots into a house church and spread their teaching from there. The development in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the office of overseer, what comes to be represented as bishop, an overseer not just of a local house assembly, but of all the house assemblies in a given city, was extremely important as a practical remedy for this organizational problem. Pompeii was also a city of people who enjoyed life whenever they could. Everywhere in the ruins are signs of the earthy pleasures that punctuated their lives. On every street, you can find a thermopolium, the ancient Roman equivalent of a fast food restaurant. The pottery jugs built into the brick counters held a variety of foods, whether warm lentil stew or dried fruits and nuts or olives or olive oil. It was typical for most people to have their lunch on the go from one of these snack bars, returning home only for the evening meal. There are also dozens of bakeries in Pompeii. Flour was ground on location in mills made from volcanic rock, which was found not to break off and leave little bits of stone in the flour. And then it was baked in wood-fired ovens. It was a fundamental staple of the common person's diet. We also find taverns called tabernae throughout the city, one bar for every 80 or so residents, according to one estimate. These were people who enjoyed getting clean, as the multiple Roman baths in the city attest. Anyone could use these public facilities for a nominal entry fee. It was not the cost, but the possibility of leisure time that would have determined who did and did not get to visit the bathhouses. They would remove their clothes in the apoditarium, which still shows the cubbies used for individual users' storage. We don't know if they covered up with anything like a wrap, as Greeks and Romans would regularly exercise in the nude, so why not bathe in the nude as well? The principal advantage of the bathhouse was the caldarium, a hot sauna that might also feature a heated pool. The effect was accomplished by creating a secondary floor over an open space through which hot air would be forced by slaves operating bellows over an exterior furnace. In some facilities, the air also traveled through clay pipes in the walls. A good sweat was considered to be cleansing. There were two actual bathing areas, one of warm water called the tepidarium and a cold pool called the frigidarium. It is thought likely that the cold plunge ended the ritual, waking people up again for re-entry into their daily routine. Bath facilities also often included garden areas for quiet relaxation in the middle of a bustling city, and in the case of the Stabian baths in the heart of town, an exercise area as well. Men and women bathed separately. The baths were not a place for dalliance. The dozens of brothels were a different story, showing a population, many of whom also didn't mind getting down and dirty. One such establishment near the Forum is especially well preserved. It has multiple small bedrooms and features popular frescoes over the entryway to each doorway, illustrating a variety of positions to try. Physical exercise and athletic activities were important to these people as well. Large spaces were devoted to physical exercise and intramural competitions, like the older Palestra Sanitica, which the population outgrew by the turn of the era. At the far east of the excavations, we find an expansive athletic complex, a much larger palestra or exercise facility, and a grand amphitheater. The grand palestra consisted essentially of 4 porticos with changing facilities surrounding a great open area and a swimming pool. More serious competition, for example, intramural athletic competitions between Pompeii's athletic citizens and those of nearby rival Noceria, or staged gladiatorial combats, happened in Pompeii's immense amphitheater. This is the oldest stone amphitheater and most completely preserved in all Italy. Unlike the Colosseum and the Flavian amphitheater in Puteoli, this one was not equipped with a system of underground passageways and alcoves for the preparation of the next act, but it could seat no fewer than 12,000 spectators. The other major center of entertainment in the city was its theater and music hall. Latin drama was at its height when Pompeii was likewise most flourishing, and one could expect that the population enjoyed a steady diet of the comedies of Terence and Plautus and the tragedies of Aeneas and perhaps recent works like those of Seneca. The music hall, used for singing and poetical recitations, was a smaller version of the theater and was originally covered with a vaulted wooden roof for acoustic purposes. Both opened up onto a large enclosed quadrangle for gathering and for socializing and finding snacks during intermission. It is believed that this area could also be secured closed off to the public and used to house gladiators, whether professional prize fighters or prisoners and slaves condemned to die for their entertainment value, prior to their appearance in the amphitheater. A trip to Pompeii is an invitation to walk among and alongside these ancient people. The early church drew upon populations such as this one. As we allow ourselves to visualize life in the streets and buildings of Pompeii, we are peering into that world that Paul, for example, addressed so poignantly. A world of rich and poor who needed to learn new ways of relating to one another as members of one family. A world of gods and lords from whose worship it was indeed difficult fully to disentangle oneself. A world of pleasures for eyes, belly, and loins, from which it was difficult to turn. And as we see them more clearly, we may understand our place among Paul's audience and his challenge to us and our patterns of living more fully as well.